Well, good morning. I'm Tim, one of the pastors here. Welcome to those of you who are watching the live stream this morning. Glad you tuned in. And I'm going to diverge just a bit here, but before church this morning, I had this conversation with somebody who asked me a question, and I think it's a real important question. They asked me, for somebody who's a follower of Christ, like, what happens after they die? Like, what happens to their body? What happens to them? And it was a good question. We had this I thought it was a good conversation, and I think it's a point of maybe confusion for lots of people. But, my understanding of what the Bible says is that when we die, our bodies die. That's what death is to us. It's the death of our bodies. But our spirits, our souls live on. And so there's this separation of the soul and spirit from the body at death. And Paul teaches us in 2 Corinthians that to be absent from the body, to die, is to be present with the Lord. And so I take that to mean that when I die, my body there'll be no life in it, but then I will be ushered into the immediate presence of God. But I won't have a body. It will be this disembodied presence with God. But I'm with God. And that's where I will be. That's how I will live until Christ returns. And then when Christ returns, we're told that the dead in Christ will be raised. And so at that point, what I believe Scripture teaches is that we'll be united with our new bodies. And so the soul and the body will be united at that point, and we will live a bodied existence. It'll be a body similar to what we have, but it'll be different because there'll be no weakness, no frailty, no sin. All that will be gone, and I'll be able to run a marathon without training. It will be just so nice. But that's our hope. That's our hope. Death is not the end. Death is we enter into this new realm of existence, but we're still alive, and we're with the presence of God, and then at some point, then the body and soul come back together, and thus we shall be with the Lord forever, is what Paul says. And I thought of that this morning because somebody asked me the question, but I also thought about it with that last song that we sang about Christ and his return. So that's a freebie, not in the notes, but I wanted to say that. Today, we end this series on the book of Colossians. I think this is message number 15, if I'm not mistaken. So it's been a long journey, but we're going to end it today. And whenever I take a team of people to Sierra Leone, I have this tradition that I follow. And what it is that before we all head off to the airport, we gather on Sam and Josephine's porch and we take a picture. We take a picture of the team and the CSAs, and then whoever else shows up. And there's always these other people who show up, and sometimes I look at these pictures, I don't even know who that guy is or who she is. But we have these pictures together. So, sorry, I'm having trouble with this mic. It's new, and I haven't quite adjusted it right. But anyway, this is 2013. That's the goodbye picture. Then next we'll see 2016, I think. That was 16. And then next will be 2018. And then next will be 2020. And then I don't have a 2022 because last minute plans, we had to change, quickly pack, head off to the airport, and we didn't get a picture. And bummer. I wish we would have taken 5 minutes just to get a picture. But anyway, we say goodbye, we exchange these sweaty hugs, we tell people we love them, and we're off. Now, what does that have to do with Colossians? Well, in this last section, we see a picture of the final picture of this church in Colossians that Paul has been writing about before he signs off. And in this, when we look at these verses, what we see 5 greetings, and we see 13 people and 3 churches and 2 letters and 1 house church. And it's kind of like Paul says, okay, it's a wrap. It's over. And what I want us to do today is kind of imagine that each of these verses we're going to look like is a picture. And we're going to look at each of these pictures and see what we can find out. Okay? So that's what we're going to do. Colossians chapter 4, verses 2 through 18. Okay, verse 2. Paul writes, "Devote yourselves to prayer, being watchful and thankful." The picture we see is this picture of prayer. Prayer is front and center in Paul's life. And if we go back to kind of like the start of the book in chapter 2 and verse 1, we see Paul there. He prays for the church in Colossae, and he says, "I want you to know how hard I am contending for you and for those at Laodicea and for all who've not met me personally." When Paul says he's contending hard, I take that to mean he's praying hard for them. He's contending before God for them. And when I covered that clear back, when was it? February 27th, I mentioned that there are 6 things that I'm contending for in prayer as we were in Lent. And Lent's long over, but I'm still contending for those 6 things in prayer on a regular basis. And so I wonder if any of you are contending in prayer for anything as we go on. So that's how we begin this little thing on prayer. And then we go on to verse 3, and Paul mentions this open door. Okay, pray for us too that God may open a door for our message so that we may proclaim the mystery of Christ, for which I am in chains. So now Paul asks specifically that they would pray something for him. And it goes something like this, please pray for me. Pray that I would have open doors with guards and fellow prisoners, and that I would have an opportunity to talk to them about Jesus. That's his prayer. And, we can do this. We can pray and ask God for open doors or times, places, situations when we'll be able to share our faith, tell our stories. And, just a little homework assignment. I would challenge you to pray this for like 30 days. Pray this for like 30 days. For the next 30 days, pray that God would give you an open door. And I think he will. It'll be amazing, the doors that open before us. That's the open door. But then we come to verse 4. He says, pray that I may proclaim it clearly as I should. That's about telling. Pray I may proclaim it clearly as I should. The first thing I thought about when I looked at this was the hymn Amazing Grace. Amazing Grace. And just listen to the lyrics, because this is a story about somebody's relationship with Christ, really. But it goes, amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I don't know about that word wretch, but, we're highly valued in God's sight. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. Was grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. And then through many dangers, toils, and snares, we have already come. 'Twas grace that brought us safe thus far, and grace will lead us home. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was blind, but now am found. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. And that's kind of what we tell people when there's this open door that we have. I once was lost, but now I'm found. I once was blind, but now I see. And that becomes our story as we personalize it for each one of us. What I would say to you is what's your story? What's your amazing grace story? And it would be good to spend some time with that story. It would be good to think about it. It would be good to write some things down. It would be good to be able to have it in your mind in such a way that if there comes an open door, you'll be able to tell it with somebody. Tell it to somebody. Let's go on then. Who do we tell it to? Verse 5, Paul mentions outsiders. Outsiders. He says, be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Outsiders here for Paul would be people who are outside of Christ, people who are not following or loving or serving Christ. Those would be the outsiders. And, Paul says two things about this. And he goes, number one, be wise in how you act toward them. Be wise in how you act toward outsiders. And I think it means that sorry about this mic. Next week it'll be ready. But anyway, I do think it means that, to ask for wisdom, how to approach people, how to converse with people. It means to weigh your words carefully. Because, we all know that words can encourage and words can build up and words can affirm, right? But words can also wound and judge and offend. So Paul says, be wise in how you speak to outsiders. And then secondly, he says, make the most of every opportunity. In other words, don't sleepwalk your way through these open doors. I think, it could mean something like, don't dominate the conversation. Don't make it all about you. Show some interest. Ask some questions. Listen. Earn the right to talk about these kinds of things. And often followers of Christ are not good at this at all. And it hurts us, and it gives us a bad reputation. I was in a conversation with somebody this week, and it's somebody I see periodically, and I just listen. This person just talks. It's all about them, and they never stop to say, well, how are you doing? Or what is your name? Or who are you? And so often that's what we're like. But be wise in the way you act toward outsiders and make the most of every opportunity. So what would it mean for you to act wisely? What would it mean for us to make the most of every opportunity? And then we go on to verse 6. Paul talks about grace and salt-filled conversations. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer anyone. So really with everybody, not just outsiders, but with everybody, but Paul here is talking about outsiders. He's saying your conversations with them should always be full of grace. Full of grace. Not judgment, not scorn, but grace. And what is grace? Grace is God's undeserved favor and love and mercy to us. That's what grace is. Undeserved favor, undeserved love, undeserved mercy to us. So is that how you treat other people? Do you treat them the way you think they deserve to be treated? Or do you treat them with grace? Do you sincerely love them? Do you show them mercy? Let your conversation be always full of grace. And then he goes, seasoned with salt. Seasoned with salt. Now, salt preserves, right? We all know this. Salt preserves. And so do the words you speak aim to preserve relationships? And how you talk to people, are you talking in such a way that relationship is going to be preserved? And then he goes, seasoned with salt. Salt not only preserves, but salt flavors. It flavors. And so when you have a conversation with somebody, does that conversation leave a good taste in their mouth? Does it leave a good taste in their mouth? Paul says, I want you to have these grace-filled, these salt-filled conversations with people. And often, that's not what we're known for. Often, that's not how we come across. And Paul is saying, grace and salt, grace and salt. Go down to verse 7. And so that's kind of this little paragraph that he gives of final instructions. And then in verse 7 on is final greetings. And it's full of all kinds of names, hard to pronounce, that I'm just going to totally massacre. But I'll let you know that right up front. So verse 7, he goes, Tychicus, whoever, will tell you all the news about me. He's a dear brother, a faithful minister, and fellow servant in the Lord. And so Tychicus is the person that delivered the letter to the church in Colossae. You know, they didn't have postal carriers like we do today, so it needed somebody to walk it or run it or take it to Colossae, and it was anyway, it was this Thai guy who did it, and Paul highly trusted the Thai guy. And Paul heaped all kinds of praise upon him, because Paul said, he's a dear brother to me. He's a dear brother to me. In other words, like, he's this close friend. He's this close friend who's as close as a brother to me. And then he goes, he's this faithful minister, in the Lord. And so what more needs to be said of Ty? I mean, he's faithful to God. And he's this example that all of us can aspire to be faithful like Ty. And then Paul says he's a fellow servant in the Lord. And so Paul and Ty, they served other people, or they served God through serving other people together. And there are some people that just like to be served, right? They just like to be served rather than serve others. But Ty was somebody who liked to be served, who liked to be served. And so of dear brother or sister, faithful minister in the Lord, fellow servant in the Lord, which of these three maybe speak to you this morning? Which of them do you want to become more like? And in which of these areas do you need to grow? Verse 7. And then we go on to verse 8, encouragement. Paul says, I'm sending Ty to you for the express purpose that you may know more about our circumstances. So he's going to just tell them how Paul is doing there in prison. And he's also going to encourage their hearts. So this guy is an encourager. And so Paul sent Ty to Colossae to encourage the church. And then we come to verse 9. Ty is coming with Onesimus, our faithful and dear brother who is one of you. They will tell you everything that is happening here. And so last week we learned that Onesimus was a runaway slave. That his owner was in Colossae. His owner was Philemon. And he ran away, ended up in Rome, and somehow in Rome he got connected to Paul. Through that connection, Onesimus became a follower of Christ, and then more than that, Paul says he became a dear friend to me. He's dear to me. But then Paul has a dilemma. Now he's befriended this runaway slave. They've gotten very, very close, but Paul says, no, we need to make things right. And so he writes this letter on behalf of Onesimus to Philemon and says, I want you to see him as a brother, and I want you to greet him like you would greet me. And that's the backstory here. And if you want to read some of the backstory, just read the little book of Philemon, and you'll have it there. And so that's Onesimus. But notice how Paul talks about him. This dirty, rotten, runaway slave that just let him have it. I mean, let justice be done. Put him in chains as soon as he gets, no. Paul says he's faithful. Paul says he's a dear brother. Like he says he's one of you. You would never know Onesimus was a runaway slave by how Paul describes him and by how Paul talks about him. I mean, that's grace. That's the good news. That's the gospel. And so we all need to ask ourselves, how do we describe people? How do we describe people to others? What descriptors do we use to describe people? And Paul teaches us here how to do that. He doesn't look at the bad. He looks at the potential and the good. And he's faithful, and he's a good brother, and he's one of us. So let's treat him that way. There's a lot there. And then we go on to verse 10. Aristarchus. Just call him Ari. And then there's Mark and Barnabas. So my fellow prisoner Ari sends you his greetings, as does Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, and you have received instructions about him if he comes to you, so welcome him. And so this is the first of 5 greetings that we find here as the letter ends. Greet these people greet you. And it comes from Ari, and he's one of Paul's fellow prisoners. Now, there's a lot of backstory to this because, he said, Mark now is sending the church greetings. Well, who is Mark? Oh, he's the cousin of Barnabas. Well, so why does Paul tell us this? Well, there's a backstory to this. So go to the book of Acts, and on the first missionary journey, Paul and Barnabas set out, and they took Mark with them. And at some point in that trip, Mark deserted them and went back home, went back to Antioch. And we don't know why he did this, but we just know that he did. And then later on, Paul and Barnabas says, okay, it's time to go out and take a second trip. And so Barnabas says, hey, I want to take Mark again and give him a second chance. And Paul says, no way, no second chance for Mark. And Acts tells us that they had a sharp disagreement. So here's 2 of the early prominent church leaders, Paul and Barnabas. They have a sharp disagreement, and they go their separate ways. Paul takes Silas, Barnabas takes Mark, and off they go. But what's significant here is the fact that Paul mentions Mark, and so we know that somewhere in there that Paul and Mark reconciled. They came back together. They made things right. And I think that probably means that Paul had to eat some humble pie. Paul had to admit he was wrong. And it's this picture of reconciliation, and now they're together in Rome. The obvious question is there somebody that you need to reconcile with? Is there somebody that you've had a sharp disagreement with that now it's time to reconcile with them? Or is there somebody who needs to reconcile with you? And so I say, things happen among friends and among families and in marriages. Things happen at work. Things happen here at church. And especially over the last 2 years. The last 2 years have been brutal for relationships. There's been a lot of sharp disagreements and breaking of relationships. And it's time for forgiveness. It's time for reconciliation. It's time for listening. It's time for talking. It's time to drop grudges. It's time to stop slandering. And Paul and Mark can show us the way to relational healing. Now, verse 11. Jesus, not Jesus, the Son of God, but Jesus who's called Justus, he also sends greetings. These are the only Jews among my coworkers for the kingdom of God, and they have proved a comfort to me. More greetings. And Paul's just saying, I've got people here with me in prison, who are helping me. They're providing comfort. They're providing strength. And then verse 12, he talks about Epaphras. He goes, Epaphras, who is one of you and a servant of Christ Jesus, he also sends greetings. And Epaphras, he's always wrestling in prayer for you, that you may stand firm in all the will of God, mature and fully assured. Now, Epaphras is an important player in the church in Colossae because Epaphras was the one who started it. He was the one who made it happen, who made it go. And so when Paul speaks of him in verse 7 and 8, he goes, you learned the news about Jesus from Epaphras, our dear fellow servant, who's a faithful minister of Christ on your behalf, and who also told us of your love and your spirit. So it was Epaphras who had a big part in starting the church there. And as he would then, he has a deep concern for this church. He cares about it, and that concern is expressed in his praying. And Paul says he's like a wrestler. He's on the mat, and he's praying for you. He's wrestling for you in prayer. And I like what he prays. 2 things. He goes, he prays that they would stand firm in the will of God. So he prays that the church in Colossae would have a spine of steel. That when it comes to their faith in Christ, they'd have a spine of steel. And that would lead them to being firm in the will of God. That's how he prayed for them. This prayer of wrestling. And today we would say, well, that's the gift of intercession. Some people are called to intercede for other people. They're called to be intercessors. And I think Epaphras was one of those. And I just wonder, like all of you here, those of you on the live stream and others, I wonder how many of you feel that God has called you to something like this. That maybe the main thing for you is to wrestle in prayer, to get on the mat and work and sweat and pray for people. Because God does call people like that, and we need people like that. So Epaphras wrestled in prayer, and then we go on to verse 13. He goes, I want to vouch for this guy, that he's working hard for you and for those at Laodicea and Hierapolis. Epaphras not only prayed hard, but he worked hard. And he's working hard for 3 churches. There's a church in Colossae that he helped start. There's a church in Laodicea. And we read about Laodicea later on in Revelation chapter 3. It's one of the 7 churches of Asia Minor. But this other church, Hierapolis, we don't know anything about it. It's the only time it's mentioned. But these 3 churches are all kind of in the same area, like maybe Canby, Hubbard, Woodburn, something like that. And Epaphras is working with these churches. And then going on to verse 14, Luke and Demas, doctor and deserter. And then our dear friend Luke, the doctor, and Demas send greetings. I give my greetings to the brothers and sisters at Laodicea and to Nympha and the church in her house. So there's these more greetings. So Luke is the medical doctor. We know that Luke often traveled with Paul when he went on these journeys, these missionary journeys. We know that Luke was not just a medical doctor, he was an amateur historian. Because he wrote the Gospel of Luke and he wrote Acts, and he begins both of those books by talking about the research that he did to make sure that what he wrote was true to fact. And so there's Luke, and Paul says, he's my friend. He's my really, really good friend. And then there's Demas. What do we know about Demas? Well, if we look at the last book that Paul wrote, 2 Timothy, and we look at the last chapter, the last book Paul wrote, in the greeting part of the book like this, Paul says, Demas deserted me and went to Thessalonica. So now Demas is with Paul, a part of the team, a support and help and encouragement to him, and at the end of his life, Demas has deserted him and gone off. And so, Paul knows what it's like to have a close friend or a close companion take off and leave everything behind. He knows what it's like to have somebody turn their back on him. He knows the hurt. He knows the pain that causes. And Demas is somebody like that. But then he goes, greet Nympha and the church in her house. Only time that Nympha is mentioned. So there's a woman in Colossae who has opened her house, and that's where the church, or some of the church, is meeting, and Paul wants to send her greetings. She didn't live in Colossae. She lived in Laodicea. So her house and the church that met in her house was in Laodicea, and Paul sends her greetings. Now, at this time, there were no church buildings. There wouldn't be church buildings for like 200 years after this, minimum. So for the first 250, 300 years of the church, where did they meet? Well, they met in people's houses. And we know in Rome they met in the catacombs, and we visited the catacombs. We walked 7 stories down into the earth and saw where the Christians would gather there in the catacombs. And they kind of met wherever they could find a safe place because they were under persecution. Going on to verse 16, letters. After this letter has been read to you, those in the church in Colossians, see that it's also read in the church of the Laodiceans, that they in turn read the letter from Laodicea. Paul wrote to the people in Colossae, and he wrote to the church in Laodicea. We have Paul's letter to the Colossians, but we don't have Paul's letter to the Laodiceans. It's vanished, it's disappeared, it's gone. And we also know that Paul wrote not one, not two, but 3 letters to the Corinthians, but we only have 2 of them. So I often wonder, someday, is somebody going to dig up the 3rd epistle to the Corinthians, or somebody going to dig up, the letter to the Laodiceans? It's possible. But it just intrigues me that there are letters that were written that we don't have not anymore. And I wonder what they said. Letters. And then there's verse 18. I'm just going to call him Arch. Tell Arch, see that you complete the ministry you've received in the Lord. Now, why does Paul single this guy out? I don't know. I'm not sure I want to be singled out for this. But he started something for Christ and he hasn't completed it. And so Paul says, hey, buddy, finish the work. Get it done. And that's good. That's good advice for all of us, right? And then we come to verse 18, last verse. I, Paul, write this greeting in my own hand. Remember my chains. Grace be with you. Somebody is there, maybe it's Ty, who's writing the letter as Paul dictates it, but then Paul signs it in his own hand. I, Paul, write this greeting in my own hand. And then he says, remember my chains. Chains means Roman prison cell. And so Paul's a prisoner of the Roman Empire. He didn't kill anyone. He didn't rob any banks. He didn't kidnap anyone. So what did he do? He just taught about Jesus. He just preached about Jesus. He just told people about Jesus. And he was so intimately connected with Jesus that he chose Jesus over prison. If I end up in prison because of my love for Jesus, so be it. And there Paul is in prison because of his commitment to Christ. Now, we don't stand a chance of being arrested for our faith by our government and sent to prison, like other people in other countries in the world do. But I think we still have things that imprison us, that keep us in chains, like cancer, or our deep, deep grief, our loneliness, financial stress, gender dysphoria, anxiety, our struggle for sobriety, and on it goes. These are the kinds of things that can feel like prison chains that weigh us down. But to that, Paul says, grace be with you. Grace be with you. And what a way to end. Grace be with you. I mean, grace is the salvation that we have in Jesus, and there's nothing we can do to earn it. It's just a free gift that we receive when we trust in Christ. And so grace to become followers of Christ and grace to live out our following of Christ. We're not alone. We have help. It's called grace. And Paul's last word to them is, grace be with you. Period. End. It's a wrap. Tie. Get this letter to the Colossians. So 3 points of application. 3 points of application. Jesus and his gospel are worth standing up for, even to the point of imprisonment, even to the point of death. Let that sink in. It's hard for us as Americans, people in the West, to let that sink in. It really is. It seems so far from us. How important is Jesus and the gospel to you? How important? If it meant imprisonment, if it meant death, would you stay in line? Or would you run? That's number one. Jesus and the gospel we're standing up for. And then two, the church is people and not a building. The church is people and not a building. Like I said, for the first 200 plus years of church history, they met in homes, or they met in the catacombs, or they met in any safe place they could find. And you know what happened? The church grew. And you know what? It was during a time of persecution. In the first 300 years of the church's history, there were 10 waves of persecution from the Roman Empire upon the church. It was persecution after persecution after persecution, and we don't have any place to meet. We're just this ragtag group of people. We'll meet in any front room or family room or backyard we can find. And the church grew. It flourished. The church is not about buildings. And I think in our experience, the building is so much a part of what the church is. And we can be thankful for buildings, but we really don't need them in one sense, if we're going to go back to how it started. I remember a few years ago, well, I guess it's 10 or 12 years ago, whenever it was, Heather and I went to Moscow, to Russia, and I did some speaking there to some of our international workers. And I remember talking to one of those international workers, and he was talking about Uzbekistan, and that we had international workers who were in Uzbekistan as business people, because you couldn't get in as a missionary. They were working with the underground church in Uzbekistan. And you know how they had church in Uzbekistan? They didn't even meet in living rooms. They were organized so that two Christ followers would go for a walk. So Craig and I were out in the city, and we're just walking, and while we're walking, we're having church. How are you doing? How can I pray for you? What are you learning? What are you struggling with? Who is God? I mean, they're walking and they're having church. And then they have planned this with two other people so that they cross paths. And when they cross paths, they switch partners. And they do it again. That was church. That's how they did church. And there's all kinds of ways around the world that people have church that have nothing to do with a building. And so thank God that we have a building. But the church is not a building. Which then, number three, is that the church is a community of Christ followers. In other words, the church is you. The church is me. The church is you and somebody else. The church is all of us. It's people. It's relationships. That's what the church is. And I think a hurdle to our Christian community is our American individualism. American individualism is so strong in our culture. It's a part of our DNA almost, so much so that we don't even hardly recognize it most of the time. But I think it's a hurdle to our community and to our relationships. And so each of us needs to ask ourselves, how is my American individualism affecting my relationship to other people in the church? Especially coming out of COVID, where there's been such isolation. It's a question that all of us need to ask ourselves. And so I end the series the way Paul ended the book, grace be with you. Amen. Let's pray. Take a few moments of silence and just ask God what He wants you to hear this morning, what you can do about it. Where's God in your life? Where's Christ in your life? Lord Christ, we give ourselves to you. Speak, Lord, for we are attempting to listen. Amen. We're going to sing a song to end, but I just thought of one more story. I might as well tell it. Kind of fits in here about Paul being in prison, the persecution part. A few weeks ago, I was on a Zoom call with my best friend from college, and we were talking. And of course, the war in Ukraine came up, and we talked about that. And he said that like 20 years ago, he had gone to Ukraine and had been there and had met some people in the church there. And he told the story about this pastor that he met that one Sunday he was in his church, and not his church, the church in Ukraine and in Kiev, and he was preaching, and in the middle of a sermon, guards came in, arrested him, and took him to prison. And he was in prison for 12 years. And he was mistreated while he was in prison. And then he was freed. And he came back to the church and finished his sermon. It's the first thing he did. He goes back to the church, he finishes his sermon, and he says, I am still going to come, I'm still going to be your pastor, I'm still going to be talking about Jesus no matter what happens. If I go back to prison, I go back to prison. If I don't, praise God. And he was never arrested again, never went back to prison. But that story rattled me. I thought, oh man, would I go back and finish the sermon knowing that I could end up in prison again? Get me a ticket, to London or something. Get me out of town. But anyway, there's just amazing, remarkable, committed people, but by the grace of God, withstand all kinds of stuff for the cause of Christ. Let's stand and sing.